At 13, she was already learning to smile while her heart shattered. But this Tudor princess would soon discover something far more dangerous than her brother's rage. She defied a king, married her enemy, and destroyed a 1,000-year alliance with a single kiss. The woman who chose love over loyalty would watch her own brother hunt her children like political pawns. This story is about England's forgotten princess, Margaret Tudor, Henry VIII's sister, who became Scotland's most dangerous queen. While her brother was beheading wives, she was starting wars, stealing husbands, and rewriting the rules of royal marriage. Her life had everything: forbidden romance, choices that would haunt two kingdoms for generations, and a final act so shameless, even Henry would have hesitated. But here's what no one tells you about Margaret Tudor. She wasn't just defying her brother. She was breaking a 1,000-year-old system that treated royal women like chess pieces. What drove this Tudor princess to risk everything, not once, but 3 times? And what unfolded behind closed doors that made her own family try to erase her from history? Her story reveals what happens when a Tudor woman refuses to be controlled. If you love untold history stories, hit that subscribe button and help us bring them back to life. But first, let's witness the moment that sealed Margaret's fate and why her greatest victory would be mistaken for her greatest failure. November 1489. Margaret Tudor entered the world as Henry VII's secret weapon. Born into a family that had violently seized the crown just 4 years earlier at the Battle of Bosworth Field. Her father wasn't descended from centuries of royal bloodline. He was Henry Tudor, a Welsh exile who had lived in Brittany for 14 years, plotting his return to claim a throne through his tenuous connection to the House of Lancaster. Every day of Margaret's childhood was shaped by one terrifying fact: Yorkist claimants and other enemies wanted her family dead. By age 13, Margaret had learned something that would later startle 2 kingdoms. But before we reveal what that was, let's understand why the Tudors were so desperate for power. Henry VII wasn't some ancient bloodline. He was a usurper who had killed Richard III at Bosworth Field and claimed the crown through his mother Margaret Beaufort's Lancastrian connections and his own victory in battle. He ruled through paranoia and brilliant strategy, knowing his crown was fragile. So he turned his children into weapons. Not swords, something deadlier. Diplomatic marriages that could end wars or start them. While her baby brother Henry got to play with toy soldiers, Margaret got language tutors. French, Latin, basic Spanish. Not for fun, because future queens needed to charm foreign courts that might otherwise invade England. Her dance lessons? Training for ceremonies where one wrong step could trigger a foreign invasion. Her needlework? Practice for the endless court rituals where royal women had to smile while men decided their futures. By age 10, Margaret understood the game. Royal daughters weren't people. They were bargaining chips. The prettier, smarter, and more charming you were, the better deal your father could make. But here's what Henry VII never expected. Margaret was paying attention to everything. She watched him manipulate foreign ambassadors with fake friendships and real threats. She saw how he used money, marriages, and military pressure to keep enemies guessing. Most importantly, she learned that information was power. Knowing what people wanted made them predictable. By 1501, 12-year-old Margaret could spot lies, read diplomatic codes, and charm men twice her age into revealing state secrets. Henry VII was proud. He'd created the perfect diplomatic weapon. He was actually creating his family's greatest threat, though he wouldn't realize it for years. Then came the news that changed her life forever. Scotland wanted peace with England for the first time in living memory. The 2 kingdoms had been locked in warfare for centuries. The wars of Scottish independence, countless border raids, the humiliation of English kings like Edward III at Bannockburn. After generations of bloodshed, King James IV was willing to negotiate. The price?
a marriage alliance that would bind the kingdoms through royal blood. Margaret's blood ran cold. Scotland, the ancient enemy, where English armies had been slaughtered at Stirling Bridge and Bannockburn, where even the mighty Edward I had struggled to maintain control? Her mother, Elizabeth of York, cried when she heard. Even her paternal grandmother, the formidable Margaret Beaufort, the woman who had orchestrated Henry VII's rise to power, thought 13 was too young for such a dangerous assignment. But Henry VII had made his decision. The Treaty of Perpetual Peace between England and Scotland hung in the balance. Margaret Tudor would be the price of peace with Scotland. The marriage treaty was signed in 1502. Margaret would marry James IV of Scotland, a man 18 years her senior, a king who had already fought against England in a kingdom that had spent 3 centuries trying to destroy her family's realm. Nobody asked Margaret if she was willing to sacrifice her entire life for Tudor politics. The girl trained to be the perfect diplomatic bride was about to discover something her father never taught her. What happens when you're forced to choose between the family that raised you and the kingdom that becomes your home? Here's the moment that doomed Margaret Tudor. She believed she could serve 2 masters. When Henry VII announced her marriage to Scotland, Margaret made a fatal mistake. Instead of accepting her fate or rebelling outright, she decided to be the perfect English spy disguised as a Scottish queen. She would marry James IV, charm the Scottish court, and secretly serve England's interests from within, the ultimate double agent. Margaret thought she was being strategic. She was actually setting herself up for the most dangerous situation a royal woman could face. Being trusted by nobody and suspected by everyone. This wasn't love that destroyed her. It was the arrogant belief that she was smart enough to manipulate 2 kingdoms simultaneously. But Scotland held a surprise that would change everything about her mission. Margaret had prepared to spy on a savage. Instead, she was about to discover something that would shake everything she believed about enemies and allies.
The year is 1503. 14-year-old Margaret Tudor rode north with a magnificent procession, 200 English nobles, chests of gold, and a marriage treaty that would change history. Her destination? Scotland, England's ancient enemy. The journey took weeks. At each stop, Scottish nobles came to glimpse their future queen. But Margaret wasn't studying them. She was dreading them. She was just 14, dragged off to marry a stranger 18 years her senior, in a country that had always been England's enemy. Even her own mother had begged Henry VII not to send her. Too young, they said, too dangerous. Margaret knew the truth. She was being thrown away for Tudor politics, dumped in some backward kingdom that felt like punishment. But here's the twist that saved her life. James IV wasn't the wild, barbaric king that Tudor propaganda had portrayed him as. James IV of Scotland was a Renaissance monarch, brilliant, cultured, and sophisticated. Their first meeting at Stirling Castle revealed something surprising. James treated Margaret as an equal, not a political ornament. He asked for opinions on art, music, and theology. For a girl raised to be seen but not heard, this was revolutionary. Their wedding at Holyrood Abbey in August 1503 was Scotland's grandest ceremony in decades. But the real transformation happened afterward. Margaret established her own court, hired Scottish tutors, and began learning statecraft from James' advisors. Within months, she was attending council meetings. By her second year, she was translating diplomatic letters between English and Scottish negotiators. Margaret discovered she had inherited more than Tudor looks. She had her grandfather's political instincts.
But just as Margaret started settling into her new life, things got complicated. Margaret began receiving coded letters from her father, Henry VII. He wanted detailed reports on Scottish military preparations, noble rivalries, and James's true intentions toward England. Margaret faced an impossible choice: spy on her new husband and kingdom, or betray her birth family's trust. She chose a dangerous middle path: selective truth. She reported Scottish strength to discourage English aggression, but concealed specific military details that could help England plan attacks. This balancing act made her valuable to both kingdoms, but trusted by neither. When Prince James was born in 1512, everything intensified. Margaret now controlled Scotland's future king. English ambassadors pressed her to raise the boy with English sympathies. Scottish nobles demanded she protect him from English influence. Margaret's solution was brilliant and risky. She publicly declared her son would be raised as a Scottish king, while privately maintaining Tudor connections that could secure Scotland's survival. By 1513, Margaret had transformed from political bride to genuine power broker. She negotiated trade agreements, mediated clan disputes, and even influenced James's military decisions. The scared 14-year-old had become Scotland's most effective queen in generations. But Margaret made one fatal miscalculation. She believed her success proved she could manage any crisis. When tensions with England escalated in 1513, Margaret convinced herself she could prevent war through diplomacy. She wrote passionate letters to her brother, Henry VIII, now king, pleading for peace. She arranged secret meetings between Scottish and English representatives. Margaret Tudor had become exactly what her father intended: a bridge between two kingdoms. But bridges get burned when wars begin. In September 1513, James IV ignored Margaret's pleas and marched south to invade England. Margaret's greatest fear was about to come true. Her husband and brother were about to destroy everything she'd built. And then came the news that would define the rest of her life.
September 9th, 1513. The Battle of Flodden lasted 4 hours. When the smoke cleared, James IV lay dead with 10,000 Scottish nobles around him. Margaret received the news at Linlithgow Palace while nursing her infant son, the new King James V. 24 years old, suddenly widowed, now regent for a 1-year-old king in a country that had lost most of its leadership in a single day. Here's what Margaret faced. Scottish survivors blamed England for their catastrophe. English forces were advancing toward Edinburgh. French ambassadors offered military support, but only if Scotland became France's puppet. Margaret had days to save a kingdom. Her first decision revealed her political genius. Instead of fleeing to England, as many expected, Margaret summoned Scotland's remaining nobles to Edinburgh Castle. She appeared before them holding baby James V, speaking in fluent Scots about their shared duty to protect Scotland's independence. The symbolism was perfect: an English-born queen choosing Scotland over personal safety. The nobles granted her the regency, but with brutal conditions. She must never remarry without their consent, and she must keep Scotland free from both English and French domination. For 18 months, Margaret performed a political miracle. She negotiated a truce with Henry VIII while secretly rebuilding Scotland's military. She accepted French gold while avoiding French control. She balanced clan rivalries that could have torn Scotland apart. But Margaret's personal life was crumbling. As a widow, she was vulnerable to political marriages, kidnapping attempts, and constant pressure from ambitious nobles seeking power through her.
Enter Archibald Douglas, Earl of Angus, young, handsome, from Scotland's second most powerful family. He courted Margaret with poetry, private dinners, and promises of protection. In August 1514, they married secretly at Kinwell Church. Margaret thought she was choosing love and security. She was actually destroying everything she'd built. Here's why the marriage was catastrophic. The Douglas clan were Scotland's most ambitious power grabbers, with extensive English connections. To Scottish nobles, Margaret hadn't just remarried, she'd handed Scotland's regency to their rivals. Within weeks, the Scottish council stripped Margaret of the regency and gave it to John Stuart, Duke of Albany, who had spent his life in France and barely spoke English. Margaret's year of brilliant leadership was erased because of one emotional decision. Henry VIII's reaction was equally brutal. His sister had remarried without royal permission, a direct insult to Tudor authority. Worse, she'd chosen a Douglas, whose family had French sympathies. Henry immediately stopped Margaret's English pension and began plotting her removal. But the cruelest blow came from Angus himself. The man Margaret married for protection began controlling every aspect of her life. He isolated her from allies, made political deals in her name, and used her royal status to advance Douglas interests. Margaret realized she'd escaped one form of political manipulation, only to embrace another. But now she had no power base left to resist. When Margaret tried to annul her marriage in 1516, both kingdoms abandoned her completely. Henry VIII refused to support a sister who kept making irrational decisions. Scottish nobles refused to trust a regent who put personal desires above their realm's stability. The woman who had once brilliantly balanced competing interests was now seen as unreliable by everyone. Margaret's greatest strength, her ability to think independently, had become her fatal weakness in a world that demanded absolute loyalty. By 1517, Margaret faced the situation that destroys most powerful women. She'd become too independent for anyone to control, but too connected to ignore. Henry VIII began supporting Scottish nobles who opposed Margaret. Scottish factions started making deals behind her back. Even France, once interested in her alliance, began looking for more reliable Scottish partners. Margaret had committed the ultimate sin in medieval Europe. She'd proven that royal women could think for themselves, make independent choices, and prioritize personal happiness over duty. Her competence had made her too dangerous to trust. Her independence had made her too risky to support. But here's what her enemies didn't realize. Margaret Tudor wasn't finished. She was about to make one final choice that would secure her ultimate revenge.
The evidence was mounting against Margaret Tudor, but her real crime wasn't political betrayal. She had successfully taught Scotland to resist English control. Under Margaret's influence, Scottish nobles had learned to negotiate from strength, not desperation. Her regency had shown them that Scotland could survive without bowing to English demands. She had created exactly what Henry VIII feared most, a confident, independent Scotland. By 1518, Margaret's political isolation was complete. Her son, James V, now 7, was being raised by Scottish nobles who painted his mother as an English spy. The boy who had once been her greatest asset became her final loss. Henry VIII made his position clear through diplomatic channels. Margaret could return to England only if she renounced all claims to Scottish influence and accepted permanent exile from politics. Scotland's nobles offered an equally harsh choice. She could stay, but only as a powerless widow with no role in government. Margaret's marriage to Angus had become a prison. The Douglas clan used her royal name while denying her any real authority. She was trapped between a husband who controlled her and kingdoms that had abandoned her. The woman who had once commanded 2 kingdoms was reduced to writing desperate letters, begging for basic financial support. Her pleas to Henry were unanswered. Scotland ignored her completely. Margaret Tudor had achieved something unprecedented. She had proven that royal women could be effective, independent rulers. But medieval Europe wasn't ready for that revolution. She was being punished not for her failures, but for her success. And yet, in her darkest hour, Margaret was about to plant a seed that would grow into the ultimate Tudor victory. Margaret Tudor's final act was both heartbreaking and historically perfect. In 1527, she finally escaped her marriage to Angus and married Henry VIII, a man 6 years younger who actually loved her. For a brief moment, Margaret found genuine happiness. Stuart treated her with respect, defended her interests, and gave her the partnership she'd always sought. But it was too late. Margaret's reputation was destroyed, her political influence gone. She spent her final years in relative poverty at Methven Castle. The woman who had once worn cloth of gold now mended her own dresses. Her son James V, now King of Scotland, occasionally sent small financial gifts but refused to restore her titles or acknowledge her contributions to Scotland's survival. Margaret died in October 1541, aged 51. No royal funeral, no diplomatic mourning. History moved on as if she had never existed. But here's the twist history tried to hide. Margaret's bloodline would accomplish what her politics couldn't. Her great-grandson, James VI, would inherit both the Scottish and English thrones in 1603, uniting the kingdoms Margaret had spent her life trying to balance. The woman they called a failure had actually secured Scotland's ultimate victory, ruling England. Margaret Tudor was the first royal woman who demanded agency over obedience. She proved queens could make independent choices, think strategically, and lead effectively. She paid the price every pioneering woman pays, punishment for being first. Today, we might recognize Margaret Tudor as a woman ahead of her time, someone who demanded love in relationships, refused to be a bargaining chip, and chose authenticity over safety. Margaret Tudor, the sister history forgot, the queen who changed everything, the woman who proved that sometimes the most dangerous thing a royal can do is simply think for themselves. The woman who chose love over loyalty ultimately secured both kingdoms for her bloodline, even if it took 60 years for anyone to realize her victory.
Thank you for watching so far. If you found this story as powerful as we did, don't forget to subscribe for more untold histories just like this.